So the old man, he was an army man, real army man, because he was in the Scottish regiment, he was in the Boer War, and he was in the First World War. He was getting sick of this buddy chasing us home for Friday night when the shops used to be open at 9 o'clock. So he said, "I'll fix you bastard." So he knew Dr. Brown, our local doctor. He said, "What do you want to do with my two lads?" He said, "Can you bung them in the army?" He said, "Shoot them up here." He said, "No, examine them." He didn't examine, he just signed the paper and bang, that was it.
We Australians are rightly proud of our armed services and of their eminent history. However, there are many of us who do not have any insight into the role of civilian militia and the important role they played in our nation's defences.
Morotai, Finchhaven, Nabzab. You hear nothing about all those places. And these people would go and track it, go along and see it. They only want to go and see what it looked like. They can't get into their heads what the boys went through to do that, to get that track made.
It is almost hard to believe that the Australian Army was not derived from any sense of defence of homeland, for there was no tangible threats until World War II. Before that, our exposure to combat came about due to our allegiance to the British Empire and our responses to requests for Australian volunteers. However, as a fledgling nation coming to grips early in its existence with world conflicts, Australia literally had to grow up quickly. From a group of gentlemen soldiers under the patronage of local landowners to the digger battlers of two world conflicts would seem an almost unbelievable leap. With the ending of convict transportation in 1840, the need for a colonial force was diminished, and by the 1870s, the British garrisons had departed, leaving Australians in charge of their own defences. There was a residual feeling that we were seen as a British protectorate, and that the Royal Navy was our ever-present guardian. That feeling pervaded political thinking of the time, and up until Federation in 1901, little structural formation was made to creating an Australian Army force. As early as 1850, volunteer corps were encouraged to form across the colonies, and those were assisted by a small corps of professional soldiers. many wealthy landowners encouraged the formation of small, mounted units associated with their estates. Those units were largely made up of middle-class people who owned their mounts and could afford to pay for uniforms.
The soldiers then are much like the soldiers of today. They came from normal community backgrounds. Maybe back then they were farmers, they were sailors, they were horsemen. Today they're mechanics, they're teachers, they're policemen, and the training that we do is in many senses very similar.
South Australia took the lead in this style of recruitment. It was some time before the lower ranks and freemen were able to take part in the creation of civilian soldiers. The military was used on several occasions, both directly and indirectly, in response to civil unrest due to industrial disputation. For some of the population, this was unwarranted, and so a lingering sense of distrust and even bitterness prevailed among the working classes. In December 1854 in Ballarat, the British Army of Occupation used bayonet and shot to quell the miners' revolt of the time. The colony of Victoria was almost out of funds and sought to impose taxes on mining leases, which they believed to be highly profitable. Some indeed were, others certainly not. The miners rebelled, took up arms, and built and manned a stockade, the Eureka Stockade. The Victorian government, egged on by Britain, and this famous remark from London, "Here we are fighting a very expensive war in the Crimea, and those diggers are lighting their pipes with £5 notes in the streets of Melbourne." It couldn't have been further from the truth. 15 diggers died and 5 soldiers were killed. In January 1891, Queensland shearers went on strike against the use of non-unionised labour. The strike lasted almost 6 months, but was ill-fated due to a very wet summer season. Mounted militia were used by the pastoralists to maintain peace and to take and transport prisoners. The soldiers shot an emu and used its feathers to adorn their hats. This was later adopted as a distinctive emblem of mounted Australian troops in overseas campaigns. From the departure of the British garrison in 1870 until the beginning of the Great War in 1914, there were some overseas military involvements of Australian troops. All of them in response to British imperial requests, all of them contributing to the development of Australia's military coming of age, and all of them basically involving civilian militia, as we were yet to form our national military infrastructure. In response to a request from the New Zealand government, Australia provided more than 2,500 troops to assist in the invasion of Waikato. Almost half of those were from Victoria. They arrived in late 1863 and formed 4 Waikato regiments. The conflict was over within a year, with the loss of about 20 militiamen. Most returned to Australia, although some remained and claimed farmland for their military service. Due to outrage at the slaying of British General George Gordon, the colony of New South Wales was inundated with volunteers to enlist and fight for British interests in the Sudan. The contingent left Sydney with great fanfare and public enthusiasm. These colonials saw little action, for by the time they arrived, Britain had lost their drive for this conflict and saw the priority of defending India as their main objective. The Aussies were involved in a few skirmishes and equipped themselves well, and were granted the first battle honour awarded to any unit of the Australian Army, the Sukhane 1885 honour. The total expedition lasted 3 months. Even in 1889, on the cusp of federation, the Australian colonies could not agree on the composition and command structure for an Australian national force. As with most things, circumstances changed, and so did our national outlook. The British colony in South Africa had been happy to see the Afrikaners, or Boers, embark on a long trek and move their families and slaves to establish territories in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The Boers had not only found viable farmlands, but, be it luck or curse, they found gold. Plenty of it in mineable quantities. Using native labour, within 10 years, those goldfields were producing almost 30% of the world's ingots and even outstripping the United States. The Transvaal was swamped with outsiders seeking their fortune, including many from Australia. The Boers saw it was only a matter of time before the British would also stake their claim, and so prepared for war. The gold bought them Mauser rifles and artillery from Germany, and with this they lay siege to several British towns, including Mafeking. The Boer leader, Paul Kruger, was quoted as saying, "The only way to kill a tortoise is to wait until it sticks its head out." The Boers were outnumbered by the British, who let themselves be lured into indefensible positions. Losses were high. Reinforcements and tactical changes were necessary. The British also made several changes to high command. The call went out to Australia for military support, and the colonies responded enthusiastically. Our colonial militia were about to be bloodied in what was to be our first serious campaign. We were about to face another force of mounted infantry who had the advantage of fighting in the South African veldt. Australia lost 600 in that war, almost half of that to disease. A treaty signed in May 1902 ended the war, and by that time the Commonwealth of Australia was a year old. Our troops were now the Commonwealth Military Forces and returned home as a united national army. War-weary and traumatised, for they had witnessed the horrors of concentration camps and losses in action. Australia had yet again done its imperial duty, but at a cost. Even while we were in the midst of cleaning up the last of the skirmishes in South Africa, Australia was requested to send troops to help in the international effort to quell the Chinese Boxer Rebellion of 1900. We did send one vessel, but by the time we arrived, the main fighting had been done, and we were given the task of breaking up any remaining pockets of resistance. From a penal colony under British troops until 1870, until 1900, we had seen foreign engagements in New Zealand, the so-called Maori Wars, the Sudan, China, and a significant conflict in South Africa. The term fighting above our weight hardly sums it up. We Aussies were preparing the ground for the diggers to come. Early into Federation, and with the lessons learned in the Boer War, our military history was about to change. And with it, our story of the role of civilian soldiers in Australia. When it is realised that there was no income tax, which was not introduced until 1915, all the Commonwealth had was derived from tariffs and excise duties. We were stony broke, and Australia was starting out on its nationhood almost penniless. A statement made by the Governor-General at the opening of the first Parliament said it all. Extravagant expenditure will be avoided, and reliance will be placed to the fullest reasonable extent on our citizen soldiery. This set the scene for the next 10 years. The changes implemented prior to the Great War were made progressively over an 11-year period. Those changes were brought about by various influences. It was to create a defence force from independent colonial units with distinct colours and style into a national army, and use a minimum of full-time regulars and unpaid volunteers, with the backbone being citizen soldiers, part-time, part-trained enthusiasts. Defence was given low priority. It's a wonder we ever kept the militia units viable. With few trained officers, very little in the way of equipment, our citizen soldiers were forced to survive, just as their colonial forebears had done. Our militia was doing it very hard. Hardly an exciting beginning for our Australian Defence Force. In January 1902, Major General Sir Edward Hutton had designated the militia as the defenders of the Australian mainland. He was in favour of decreasing volunteers and increasing the militia quotient. However, his politics suggested he was more in favour of creating a standby imperial force than a continental defence force. His efforts, however motivated, were highly successful in forging a national army for this new nation, and the citizen soldier had a significant role to play in it. As he worked tirelessly to create an Australian army with scant resources, he saw the rifle clubs as a valuable resource, as a default military pool of combat-ready riflemen. The volunteer movement had set up local rifle associations around Australia. The rifle clubs did not share this view, and so there followed years of bickering and discord between the military and the rifle associations. By 1909, there were 50,000 members of about 880 rifle clubs in Australia. There was, in comparison, 26,000 militia. Add to this the social distinctions existing in the ranks at the time should have had the effect of democratizing the military. It did do little in this regard. There was clearly class bias in selecting officers. Enter Lord Kitchener, a distinguished Boer War commander who had signed the death warrants for Lieutenants Harry Breaker Morant and Peter Hancock, who many had believed were scapegoats for war crimes committed by a British irregular force known as the Bushveld Carbineers. As a result of Lord Kitchener's report on Australia's defences, compulsory military training was introduced and the Royal Military College, Duntroon, was established in June 1911.
Training in the Army's values, in understanding the role in a team, in understanding how to perform under intense pressure on operations, understanding the Army's values around courage, teamwork, initiative. They're still the same core values. And I imagine the training they did was aside the technology, very similar to the work that our soldiers do today.
90,000 youth were in training with the Citizen Militia Forces, the CMF. A further 20,000 were inducted each year until the outbreak of World War I. Not a day after Belgium was invaded by Germany and Britain had declared war, Australia's commitment created history with one single cannon shot. "17,000 kilometres from England, and while Britain was asleep, the first shot of World War I was fired from a fixed gun emplacement at Portsea on Victoria's Mornington Peninsula. We weren't under attack, and it was not a defensive shot. Rather, it was a warning shot across the bows of a German steamer attempting to leave Australian waters and get to the open seas."
There was a German freighter in port which was attempting to leave the port and did leave the port, and before the declaration of war, and as it approached the heads, war was declared and it was ordered to pull over and surrender. To effect that, they fired a shot across the bow of that ship, and the ship was the SS Pfalz, a German freighter. And the ship, after a bit of a struggle with the pilot, Mr. Robinson, the ship pulled over and was interned at Queenscliff.
Australia was at war yet again, but the reality of it and its consequences were yet to be felt. In September 1914, the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, a volunteer force of approximately 2,000 men, was tasked with the destruction of wireless stations in German New Guinea. It took only 10 days to recruit and equip this volunteer force, which consisted of 1,000 infantry and 500 naval reservists. The force included 2 machine gun sections, a signals section, and a medical section. A further militia battalion from North Queensland was to join forces with them at Port Moresby. Early on the 11th of September 1914, the attack on the German facility at Bitter Pucker commenced, and by the evening of that day, the radio station had been captured. 6 Australians were killed and 4 were wounded, representing the first casualties of World War I. This small victory would fade into insignificance as the European theatre of war claimed many more Australian lives. With the declaration of war against the Austro-German invasion of Belgium, the degree of pro-British sentiment was enormous. Andrew Fisher, soon to be Prime Minister, openly declared that Australia would support Britain to the last man and our last shilling. The state of war readiness in Australia was not a good one. With very few permanent forces and most of them militia and a lack of trained officers, we were severely underprepared. Australia had a standing army of only 3,000 men. Initially, citizen forces were allocated to guarding munition factories, important railway infrastructure, wireless stations, and other essential sites. The citizen forces played a significant role in training the AIF and the Expeditionary Force. Their officers were essential in managing and instructing at AIF training facilities when permanent officers had been detailed to the AIF. Young men from the city and rural areas who were swept up in the fervour of military exploits queued up to enlist for the 1st Australian Imperial Force. Others saw the 6 shillings per day pay as a welcome relief to the low employment conditions that prevailed, and the experience of visiting foreign shores as a welcome bonus. Initially, the conditional height was set at 5 feet 6 inches, and a narrow age limit was insisted upon. Consequently, our first volunteers were a fine set of individuals who also unfortunately represented the majority of those that sacrificed their lives at Gallipoli. The sheer volume of volunteers arriving at camps, and with very few officers, the young soldiers developed a self-dependence culture of mateship, and that would be construed as being, to a degree, unmilitary. 1 month before the landing at Gallipoli, Australian and New Zealand soldiers were involved in the Wassa riots that resulted in the destruction of a commercial district of Cairo. Our British allies claimed we had a serious criminal element in our ranks. Our own officers, who knew their men, saw only determined soldiers who would soon prove themselves as the finest and bravest body of fighting men of the Allies. They had clearly identified what we all know now as the spirit of the Anzac. With the internment of German and Austrian nationals, this presented another responsibility for our militia. The only recorded occasion on which citizen forces engaged an enemy was when 2 men opened fire on a civilian train near Broken Hill. The attackers were Turks, reacting to a call for jihad by the Ottoman Empire. Militiamen from the 82nd Infantry killed the assailants in a gun battle, but at the same time prevented angry locals attacking a camel driver's camp at the edge of town. The citizen forces reached 105,000 by 1918, but in actuality, 75% of its officers and 50% of its men had enlisted in the AIF, a significant contribution. Many former militiamen had outstanding service as officers in the 1st Australian Imperial Force, where they distinguished themselves during World War I. None more so than General John Monash, later General Sir John Monash, internationally acclaimed for his tactical skills. What distinguished him further was his declared intentions to protect those in his command from unnecessary exposure to harm. This has earned him enduring respect. The role of our women citizens during the Great War should be recognised. In those years, women were not accepted as soldiers, but were seen instead as merely supporters of the troops and maintainers of the home. During the Boer War, 2 significant contributions were made by women. 14 nurses from New South Wales had maintained field hospitals in dangerous and inhospitable regions in South Africa. 13 returned to Australia. They lost one of their number due to the illnesses ravaging the campaign at the time. All those women were middle-class professionals, some of whom had paid for their passages and equipment. Following the setting up of internment camps for the wives and children of the Boers, Australian women teachers were equally heroic. Those teachers responded to the needs of those children in camps for education and accordingly volunteered their personal time and resources to educate them. So is it any wonder that the positive contribution to the war effort by women citizens was in any way less heroic? As the war progressed and munitions factories were established, women were the mainstay production force. Many suffered serious health conditions due to exposure to chemical agents such as trinitrotoluene, better known as TNT. Women were such great supporters of the war effort that some were so incensed by conscientious objectors that they sent them, rightly or wrongly, the white feather of cowardice. Whether it was to be part of an anti-invasion force guarding the major cities of Sydney or Melbourne, or merely training others, our militia was a significant part of Australia's defences following World War I. However, at that time, many negative influences that ranged from political to economic worked against the recruitment and retention of this important military resource.
The demobilisation post the First World War, the winding back of the Defence Force between the World Wars, reflecting our ability to invest in those sorts of capabilities, of course, but also reflecting a change in community focus. You know, we needed those young men and women to get back into the community and to focus on economic generating activities.
Given the Depression of 1929, the lack of funds to adequately train and equip our militia units further exacerbated this sad state of affairs. Our military still insisted on basing its structural framework on the British Army, and this did not always suit our national requirements. By 1936, things were looking up, and the need for creation of a social context for the militia was recognised. Drill halls were renovated and improved. Annual military competitions were encouraged. Small arms competitions between units really became a feature.
We got a letter from the 52nd Battalion headquarters in Dandy that report to the Oakley Town Hall on such and such a date. So down we go. Tommy wasn't too bloody happy because he was a roughie, real roughneck. So we joined up, got going doing all our drilling that of a Thursday night at the Oakley Town Hall. But twice a year you went away on a camping, fortnight camp. Seymour, Tuttleville, Pennywheel, round up that way. So then, and I always used to put in for advance guard and rear guard because you got more money. You got 2 days extra pay. because you had to go up there, the advance party, you go up there and get everything to pitch the tents and all that. And then rear guard, you pull the bloody tent down. So that was an extra few bob in your pocket.
While this had the effect of boosting the militia component, it then drew undue comparison to the lesser amounts being paid to the permanent army soldiers. 4 shillings per day was the rate paid to a CMF private since 1929. In 1936, in an attempt to boost numbers, this was increased to 8 shillings per day, 5 shillings basic pay, and an efficiency allowance of 3 shillings to encourage attendance at training camps. Typical of peacetime, attendance at training drills did not exceed 70%, and our CMF was certainly not war ready. The training of all ranks was based on the British experience, and the militia officers were sent to England or India to become acquainted with anti-tank weaponry and the increasing use of mobile forces. While it was a benefit, it was not up to the standard of our potential enemies. Germany and Japan, who at the start of World War II were well in advance of us. Bad instruction led to bad training, which led to a large turnover of soldiers due to boredom. And as relatively inexperienced soldiers became instructors, the turnover rates increased. The Command and Staff School was opened in 1938, and regulars and citizen soldiers at least had an improved source of officer training. Despite this, the anti-invasion or anti-raid capability of our militia would have been insufficient to repel a Japanese invasion should one have occurred on 1939. Militia with rifles and machine guns may well have stopped a small raiding party, but their lack of heavy equipment rendered them almost useless in the face of an invasion force. Motorization and mechanization were needed, and Australia did not have the funds to supply those to our defenders. It is hard to believe that Britain at this time was rearming itself and selling military equipment to other forces, but showed considerable reluctance to supplying its dominions. Britain had supplied countries such as Finland and Turkey with aircraft, and others received tanks and submarines before Australia. When light horse units were converted to motorised machine gun regiments, motor lorries were used to simulate armoured vehicles. In drill halls, militia trained in mounting and dismounting vehicles using a row of chairs. Given that Australia had to import all of her oil from overseas prior to 1939, how were we to supply the Army, Royal Australian Navy, and our emerging Royal Australian Air Force? The fact is we simply couldn't. While all this was in play, the Japanese Army had developed the use of special naval landing units in their war in China. Given this, and the unreadiness of our militia in 1939 to combat a sea landing of troops and tanks together with air support, we were almost defenceless.
With the beginning of World War II, that changed. Several regiments and battalions of the First World War re-established largely around an Australian defence model, including, of course, New Guinea at the time, and then we saw them prepared and finally deployed to that campaign.
Well, when the war came, and there was the 24th, 37, 39 and 52 Brigade all parked in Trailwood and Taldarook and all around that way, and silly bastard, 6 of us come down on leave on the Easter in 41, And we all decided, oh bugger this, we'll join the Ackeye Puffs. So we go down to under the Flinders Street there, to Grove Street. I think it was the recruiting office there. We got back to bloody camp and told the colonel, you bloody idiots, and he's going to town. So next thing I'm at Caulfield. So I'm there stationed there for a while, waiting to go away. And this bloody crowd marched in. Tarzan Beasley, Harry Wild, Tommy. What the hell's going on here? So I caught up to him and I said, what's going on, Nip? He said, we're the 39th Battalion now. I said, oh. I said, what happened? So he said, well, the 4 battalions asked for volunteers. Didn't say for what, just asked for volunteers. So out of the 4 battalions, they got more out of the 39th Battalion than they did out of the other 3. So that's why they got the majority. They got called the 39th Battalion. So that's how it became 39. Well, eventually, after a while, it became the 3752 over in New Guinea, when they getting short of troops and that, and they were all combined them all together. So that's how that came about.
1 month after the declaration of World War II, large contingents of militia were called up for extended training in order for them to be posted to strategic points around Australia. The imminent threat of a Japanese invasion gave rise to an important operational need for an observational patrol of the northern Australian coastline. This task fell to the militia, who formed the North Australia Observer Unit. It consisted of a light horse mounted unit headquartered in Katherine in the Northern Territory. Following the bombing of Broome, there was heightened fear of invasion and reconnaissance, and coastal watching became a priority. At its peak, the unit consisted of 550 men who had a reputation for being tough individuals who could withstand many long hours in the saddle under extreme weather conditions. They were truly Australia's bush commandos. This group chose to call themselves Knackaroos, although they also later became known as Curtin's Cowboys. There were about 60 Indigenous horsemen in the group who proved to be excellent guides. Presently, Australian Army reservists still maintain this work. The reservists are primarily locals who both know the areas surveyed and who are well acclimatised to the hot and humid conditions that prevail. The units known as Norforce are representative of the local ethnic makeup and have an Indigenous component of 60%, all of them citizen reservists. Its operational headquarters is presently in Darwin. Our defences were largely carried out by 265,000 militia, organised into 5 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions. But things took a drastic turn when Japan entered the war. The Australian 8th Division was caught up in fighting the Japanese and were largely part of the surrender when Malaya and Singapore fell in succession to overwhelming war-toughened Japanese troops. Back in Australia, the decision had been made to send militia units in Papua New Guinea.
We finished up over in New Guinea, sitting hanging around there like a fart in a bottle. So we walked up one day and we said to the colonel, he said, what's going on? He said, well, tell you what I'll do. I'll give you the job of provost for a while, he said, until something turns up. Yeah, well, that'll do us. So Nab-Zab, Millen Bay, all around the countryside riding motorbikes around.
Initially, they were supposed to lend support with logistical supplies as nursery troops, but it wasn't long before they were in a combat role. As we suffered casualties early in the operation, the militia were required to act as rearguard defenders. This they did in splendid fashion. The 39th and 37th Infantry, largely militia, created history by being part of a successful victory over the Japanese at Milne Bay.
They brought that Australian refusal to submit, that refusal to give up, that determination to be successful when everything was on the line.
But for the first time, our regular army saw the fighting spirit of their militia and gave them great respect. This helped remove the dreaded M designation. When a militiaman joined the regulars, his service number carried the letter M, designating him as a former citizen soldier. As the war progressed and the successes of the militia became known, this designation was rightly done away with.
We really looked after Australia. We wanted it. It was our land, our country, our home. Now, a lot of people don't realise that there were people still here looking after the country while our stupid buggers were away.
Australia had been successfully defended and the Japanese invasion forces were halted. Our militia had both fulfilled their role as defenders and demonstrated their fighting spirit to their comrades. In the years that followed, our militia proved more than equal to their defence task, and despite bombing raids and submarine incursions, Australia was never invaded. Our story of the beginnings of the citizen soldier in Australia was one that simply had to be told. Our country has relied on this Homeland Defence Force, yet it has had to literally fight for its own existence when economic and political influences were against it. In peacetime, citizen reservists just did not receive any priority and as a consequence could not maintain their operational capacities. Yet, when it came to creating the 1st and 2nd AIF armies, the volunteers from our CMF units were significant, a fact not always acknowledged by some historians. From 1972 until 1974, the 70% manpower targets could not be uniformly achieved, and the CMF was replaced by the Australian Army Reserve. There can be no argument that this was the way forward.
I've never served in the regular army per se, although I absolutely feel like I am part of the Defence Force and part of that broad church. And of course, this idea, much like our civilian life, this idea that there are kind of two ways to serve in army, that you're a full-time regular member or a part-time reservist, is just not true. There are so many ways that people serve in uniform and out, so many ways that we serve in blocks, in a permanent part-time capacity on contracts, if you like. I think these ideas, if ever they were strong in the minds of Defence Force members, are no longer there. I don't see any difference in the headquarters you're sitting in right now is a composite of people who work full-time, part-time and everything in between. Back then, I understand and can imagine that those sorts of challenges around being a member of the AIF versus the militia may have been front of mind, but I doubt it was front of mind in Papua New Guinea, on the track.
We have told this story to redress some of those clumsy politics and to do justice to many thousands of citizen soldiers who willingly gave so much in our defence.
As it goes by, you go to bed one night and it all comes back to you. And as Dad said, never, ever tell anybody what you've seen or what you've done. You went overseas, you fought for your country, you brought your flag back, and that's all you want to worry about.